Did you watch the Colbert Trudeau interview?
No, I couldn't bring myself to. It was too painful.
It was pretty rough. I mean, look, from the amount that there was like 3 minutes spent on Canadian bacon, like that level of just like lowbrow fucking nonsense. But this idea that Poilievre is like characterizes Canada's Trump, and that's the only context in which he's known to Americans. Is like, oh, there's like, U.S. has their Trump and Canada has their Trump, and it's Pierre Poilievre, and it's so fucking stupid. It's like they're so different. They're nothing alike.
Yeah. No, and Pierre like very clearly like resents people even asking him to talk about Trump or express opinions on Trump, right? Like it's not relevant to his political project at all. I'll make a prediction though, Brogan. I bet you if Kamala Harris gets in America and then Pierre gets in Canada, I bet you there will be a faction of Americans that will come to really like Pierre. Like they will come to sort of imagine him as like the cool based leader of this continent, and then Kamala Harris being their lame president, and they'll sort of be like, oh man, wish we lived in Canada. Canada's prime minister is so cool, unlike our lame left wing horrible Democrat woman president. That's my prediction.
It's probably
it's hard to imagine.
It's good. That's probably a good prediction.
It's hard to imagine Pierre and it'll become relevant what you just brought up if Trump gets elected and then Pierre gets elected, right? And sort of like those two men being the leaders of North America and what their relationship would be like, because there'll be a lot of pressure on Pierre to not do anything that sort of portrays him as being sort of a second banana to Trump or being unduly sort of subordinate to Trump. So I think it's very possible that they could have a pretty bad relationship because Pierre will be under a lot of domestic pressure to stand up to Trump and stand up to America more broadly.
I know. I don't understand, what even, I mean, I feel like I know a decent amount of his policy. I haven't got into like the nitty gritty of his potential policy, but I don't even know where they're drawing the comparison. What pisses me off about Pierre is that, I mean, it's I guess it's like he's playing to the base of sort of like that the mega that is in Canada. Like I've received emails from the Conservative Party about talking about like the WEF and and like woke, and I'm like, look, I don't want to fucking hear any politician say those words. That really drives me insane because it's just so irrelevant. But even like immigration, for example, like it's like Trump's biggest issue.
Yeah.
Pierre is completely pro-immigration. He's never expressed any sentiment against immigration or against like the idea of like Canada being this perfect like culturally coherent country without immigration, and we need to cut back immigration. Like he's never said that once.
Yeah. He's not talking about mass deportations. He's not talking about Haitians eating the cats and the dogs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard nothing about that, and I don't understand why. Like I feel like in the studio or like even I receive a lot of pushback on like I support Paul, like I'm gonna vote Poilievre.
Yeah.
And I'm not dying to. I'm not like in love with him. I'm pretty like moot on most politicians, but he just seems like the obvious choice in the next election.
Yeah.
And I don't understand where the pushback comes from. For me, it's like I feel like people are mischaracterizing him as this guy who is going to potentially change like abortion laws or like gay marriage, stuff like that, like stuff people attribute to Trump. And like it's like the Canadian politics are nothing like that. I feel like it's a completely I think it's just mischaracterizing what Canadian politics are.
But this is sort of like what I was saying before about like, the challenges that democracy faces, right? Is like people are just not taking their duties as voters as seriously as they should. They just kind of like imagine a politician in their mind and then they vote against that imaginary version of the politician, right? So there's a lot of people on the left in this country who kind of have just made up what they think Pierre is, what they kind of like imagine a conservative candidate for prime minister would be like, and they imagine that in sort of like the most hostile way possible. They imagine him as a kind of like, demonic, far-right, terrible social conservative guy. And then they vote against that imaginary person rather than actually bothering to like learn and give the person a fair shot and like, figure out what he's actually campaigning on and what he's actually promising to do. And I don't know, that just seems very irresponsible as a citizen. And the other thing too is I think that, it's very obvious that there's a lot of problems with this country right now. Like there are some serious, economic problems, there's problems with crime. Like there's a lot of significant stuff that's not working out well for your average Canadian right now. And to just kind of like hand wave away people's legitimate concerns that they have with the state of Canada in order to sort of like justify voting against the only guy who, as far as I'm concerned, is actually attempting to offer a new direction for this country, because like you've imagined some magical scenario in which he's going to ban abortion or something, that also seems very irresponsible and wrong-headed. And that's why, I don't know, like left-wingers in Canada, like, I don't know, I'd have no problem voting for Kamala Harris in America, but the left in this country is just so much less serious. They have a much worse governing record than the Democrats do in the States. So, and I wish that more left-wing Canadians would be called out for this. Like left-wing Canadians on some level, progressive Canadians, they have to own the legacy of Trudeau. Trudeau has been in power for 10 years. For the last, 4 years, he's been explicitly propped up by the NDP. So you can't even use the excuse, like NDPers can't even use the excuse that they didn't want this. Their party has been explicitly supporting Justin Trudeau's government. So, own up to it. Like, tell me what this Trudeau government has done that's been so great that we cannot afford to have a conservative government instead. And a lot of left-wing people in Canada are just very cowardly in a way that I think progressives in America are not. Progressives in America will proudly defend the Biden record, especially when contrasted to what Trump's promising. But it's much harder to get a sort of progressive Canadian to do that.
Yeah, I don't know, it's bizarre. We are in a weird, very strange position. Even I don't know if I was talking to you about. I don't know really. It's a bleed over from American politics, but I was at Wasaga Beach in Ontario, and I think I sent you a picture actually of the amount of this guy with the "fuck Trudeau" flags on his giant truck, right? And he had like 4 of them, and he just drove in circles around the parking lot the whole time, right? And there's like the other side of it is it's like how divide. I don't know if it's like division or I don't know. I mean, honestly, Canadian politics really confuse me in a way that like American politics don't. American politics seems to like very binary, very like cut and dry, and Canadian politics just don't. I feel like maybe Canadians want to LARP, to use that term, the way American politics actually have like potential huge ramifications. If Trump has never been clear on if he's going to veto a federal abortion ban. Even if you saw like he did that on his Truth Social thing, because he was asked in the interview, he didn't explicitly answer the question yes or no. JD Vance was asked, didn't explicitly answer it, and then he made a post on Truth Social and he says, of course, it's all capitals. Or no, sorry, it was Twitter. You can probably pull the tweet up. Of course, I would veto a federal abortion ban. Next sentence. I've always said it should be up to the states. And I'm like, okay, so that's still not a clear answer, because you're saying it's like in one breath you're saying I veto it, and then you're saying it's always up to the states. So that's like still up in the air. That's not Canadian politics at all. But I feel like Canadians really want that like, potential, huge social changes to be on the line, which they just aren't.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and I think your analysis of it is entirely correct. Especially sort of people in kind of like our world, right? Like when it comes to like what people want to debate, what people want to discuss, they want to discuss the big sort of sexy, polarizing, and sort of like morally divisive issues. They don't want to talk about sort of like, simple questions about taxes and how we stimulate economic growth and sort of things like that, right? They want to talk about these big sort of sexy moral issues. And American politics just has a lot more of those. Like the American political sort of system with its sort of two-party binary, it sort of sorts people into very clear camps and sort of allows things like the Jubilee thing that you were referencing earlier to sort of exist, where there's like a very sort of clear sense that the right and the left are sort of battling it out on these very high profile issues that are being adjudicated through the American presidential system and through Congress and through the courts and all the rest of it. And that's just very, like you said before, like it's very dopaminergic stuff in a way that Canadian politics is not. I mean, I think it can be. I'm somebody that's obviously been talking about Canadian politics my whole life, and I've gotten into a lot of trouble, and I've become a polarizing figure, and I've had a lot of sort of vigorous and stimulating debates. So those debates can be found. But at the end of the day, like that takes more work, and I think people would rather, even Canadians would just rather pretend like that our politics exists to adjudicate questions of immigration and abortion and gay rights and all the rest, even though it doesn't. It exists to adjudicate other questions because, in part, like it or not, like a lot of those questions that are still live issues in America have been, quote unquote, settled to a much higher degree in Canada. And that also, it's not just because Canadians are more enlightened, it's because, the Canadian political system is different, and in some ways it's a less democratic system that gives less political power to the guy with the fuck Trudeau flags than, the MAGA crew have in the States, through things like primary voting and all of that. But, these are the realities that we have to exist in Canadians, and it can be frustrating that a lot of Canadians don't seem to want to respect them.
Yeah. Who do you think the worst prime minister is? Explaining
prime minister.
Yeah, explaining to somebody who I basically my entire knowledge of Canadian politics has been like as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to hear your I like to hear your observation of like when the country, because I feel like I have this opinion, especially like hearing Nick Fuentes or Sneeko or like any of the people in my wheelhouse of like internet politics talk about the U.S. when they're like when they say that like 2024 is uniquely the fucking worst time for the U.S. ever, and never have things ever been this bad. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. Like, there's been many worse parts of the U.S. and in different cities at many different times, right? So I feel like I have that perspective, but like in Canada, I don't have that perspective at all. So is there a point to look back to where it's like, okay, Canada was like far, far, far worse objectively at this point, and now, although things seem like they've gotten worse in the last like 4 years, it's not that bad comparatively.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, like Canada was like a very, like compared to the US, like a very poor country until, relatively recently, right? Like Canada did not have like a strong economy in the way that the US did. Like we benefited a lot from the post-war economic boom. That was when Canada was really sort of developed at a sort of like massive scale. Before then, in sort of like the late 19th century, we also sort of went a belated economic boom in sort of those days. But yeah, again, like nothing compared to the US. And then we had sort of, it wasn't until the 1980s that we had free trade with America, which also sort of created a sort of like large economic boom. But it's like, like the Canada of like my dad's or like our families grew up in, like my dad was born in 1948. And it's like, you grew up in Canada in sort of the late 1940s or, before, like you imagine like the 30s or the 20s or, the early 20th century, and like Canada was just not a great place. Like it was poor, it was not very economically influential in world affairs. People had a much lower sort of standard of living than they do now. This is why there was constantly massive immigration out of Canada into America, where there was just so many more opportunities. Like all of sort of like a lot of the great sort of Canadian sort of inventors and sort of figures that we like to take credit for, were often people that couldn't get out of Canada fast enough because there was just so much more opportunity. And this was the case for most of the first half of the 20th century. So, and Canada was obviously very hard hit by the Great Depression, and that was a sort of terrible time for the country as well. So many people out of work and unemployed. Canada in the 1960s, there was, French-Canadian terrorism that caused a lot of problems, and that was a really difficult time for the country as well. When Pierre Elliott Trudeau first came to power in 1968, there was so I was talking about this on my stream last night. People were asking me about the French-Canadian terrorism and what that was sort of like. So that was like a very dark time for the country. But I don't know, like there's, and now like Canada sort of I'd say like since the 80s, like you sort of like the Canadian sort of climate that people like me grew up in was just such a much more prosperous time for Canada than we've ever known before. Like I'm so happy that I grew up when I did, right? Because like to grow up in Canada of previous decades, you were just born into a much like poorer, much more economically stagnant country in which there was just much fewer jobs, much lower wages, much less things to buy, a much lower standard of living relative to the US. Whereas in recent years, we've come much more closer to achieving parity with the US in terms of what average life is like. So I don't know. That's kind of a pretty broad answer to the question. I mean, like when it comes to like who was the worst prime minister, like the sort of the canonical answer, you can see I have my little chart of Canadian prime ministers just in the back there. But like the canonical answer is probably like uh, Richard Bruce Bennett, R.B. Bennett, who was prime minister during the Great Depression. He's sort of like widely regarded as having been a uniquely bad prime minister. Um, like a lot of people don't like Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I mean, I like him. I've come to respect him a lot more. But, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was prime minister from 1968 to 1984, he presided over a time in which Canada had a very poorly performing economy. Inflation was very high. Wages were low. Unemployment was high. Like that was a very difficult time for a lot of Canadians. So that wasn't a particularly great time for the country. And whenever they do surveys, like a lot of people will rank him as being quite a bad prime minister, even though I think that his governing record was vindicated by other things.
Interesting. I've always heard that he was for my father always said he was the best prime minister.
Yeah.
He was he was his favorite.
He was like I think that there's a lot to be said for Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Like he was the guy that sort of secured Canada's final independence from Great Britain in 1982. That was a significant achievement. He created the Charter of Rights and Freedoms into the Canadian Constitution, which I think has made all of our lives better and was objectively a good thing. The fact that it took until 1982 to have civil rights enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, I think that's kind of bizarre in retrospect that it took that long. And and he made Canada famous on the world stage. He threw his weight around a lot. He got Canada into the G7, into the Group of Seven, which is one of the most elite diplomatic groups in the world, and that sort of gave us a lot of diplomatic power of a way we didn't have previously. So there was a lot of good things that he did, and there was a lot of ways in which through just sort of sheer force of character and will as a product of his personality, that he sort of demanded praise and demanded to be loved and demanded to be sort of seen as a man of great consequence. And I think that's why a lot of people sort of had a natural sort of inclination to defer to him and his achievements. But at the same time, like I said, economically, Canada did not perform well during his tenure, and it wasn't, I think, until sort of the boom years of the 80s and the 90s, once he had sort of shuffled off, that Canada really sort of came into its own as a very wealthy, very prosperous country, the country that we all sort of take for granted as being the normal of Canadian life. I think that is something that a lot of people don't realize how late that came. And I think that Pierre Elliott Trudeau bears some responsibility for the reason why it came as late as it did.
Yeah, even growing up in Nova Scotia, Halifax had the highest murder rate in the country for a couple years in the early 2000s. And I remember this always being this perspective of, it's where I grew up. I think probably Nova Scotia would have been one of the last places to receive any sort of economic benefit or to modernize, the last to modernize along with Newfoundland. And I really got that opinion, especially from my mom and who grew up in Halifax, of how kind of dirty and poor Halifax was, and how dirty and poor the rest of the province was, which is still true to an extent. Very, very poor province, but Halifax specifically is kind of starting to receive the benefits of that Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver has gotten over the last 10 years. People are wanting to move there, start businesses there. To the detriment of people who have lived there their whole lives, who are now getting priced out of homes there. But it's starting to happen, at least in Halifax.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. You think of we think of sort of Atlantic Canada as being an economically sort of depressed part of the country, and it is. But you imagine what it would have been like to live in that part of the country when things were so much worse. You imagine what life would have been like in the 1940s or 30s or 20s or something like that, living in these parts of the country where the economy is just very simple. It's based around fishing and nothing else. And yeah, it was pretty rough. Like, there's a reason why like all of the big sort of technological and cultural innovations of the 20th century happened in America and didn't happen in Canada. There's a reason why, just as simple as this. Like, there's a reason why Canada's population is 10 times lower than America's. It's not just because Canada's colder, it's because Canada was a much, much less attractive place to emigrate to. There's a reason why all of the immigrants from Europe, chose to live in the US and not Canada. And frankly, even a reason why a lot of immigrants who came to Canada would move south, right? Along with many other native born Canadians who would move south. So yeah, the economic realities of Canadian history is, I think, a very sort of like underrated sort of topic that more Canadians should research and know about. Because I think there's a kind of assumption that because, Canada is a sort of like rich American sort of style country today, that we've always sort of been that way, or that this current outcome was in some ways inevitable and was, as opposed to being the result of a very specific policy decisions that I think were made in the late 20th century.